Go.
Okay.
Oh,
I'll
that,
upload it later.
that woman is the most popular voice in the country. Okay, here we go. Um, this is the subject for the evening. Look at that face. He's not hiding anything there. This is one charismatic human being. He's wearing, we can tell this is probably 64, 65 because the Trappists had all white before then. They added the black, which is really nice piece of trim, about 64. I'm going to begin by reading something very uncharacteristic is just read some of the Wikipedia intro, which is very helpful actually. Covers the ground we should cover to begin with and then go over it. So talks about him as an influential American Catholic author. His autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, has sold over 1 million copies and has been translated into over 15 languages. He wrote over 60 other books, hundreds of poems and articles on topics ranging from the monastic spirituality to civil rights, nonviolence, and the nuclear arms race. Question I have starting out is, why is he not a doctor of the Catholic Church? I mean, last week we talked about Teresa of Lisieux, who wrote one little skimpy book, and she was called a Catholic of the Church. A doctor of the Catholic Church. Merton was born in France. His father was from New Zealand. His mother was American born. They were both artists. They'd met at a painting school in Paris, married in London. Tom Merton was born in 1915. And it says here, after a rambunctious youth and adolescence. Remember that. He converted to Roman Catholicism while at Columbia University, and on December 10th, 1941, he arrived at the Abbey of Gethsemani. Does anyone remember what else happened during that week in December of 1941? Yes, you do. A day that will live in infamy, right?
On the 7th.
On the 7th, so just 3 days before. I think that's really important to think about in terms of the world that he went away from or got away from when he joined the he didn't up and do it. Of course, he was going to do this way before the war began, but well, at least before the war was declared and on December 7th. Anyway, let me keep going. 27 years he spent at Gethsemani Abbey out of Louisville, Kentucky. It says here this ongoing conversion, because he kept changing, impelled him into the political arena, where he became, according to Daniel Berrigan, the conscience of the peace movement of the 1960s, referring to race and peace as the two most important issues of our time. Merton was a strong supporter of the nonviolent civil rights movement, which he called, quote, certainly the greatest example of Christian faith in action in the social history of the United States. I really like that statement. For his social activism, Merton endured severe criticism from Catholics and non-Catholics alike, who assailed his political writings as unbecoming of a monk. Fascinating. During his last years, he became deeply interested in Asian religions, particularly Zen Buddhism, and in promoting East-West dialogue. After several meetings with Merton during the American monk's trip to the Far East in 1968, the Dalai Lama of Tibet praised him as having a more profound understanding of Buddhism than any other Christian he had known. And it was during that trip to a conference on East-West monastic dialogue that he died near Bangkok on December 10th, 1968. on the exact anniversary of his 27th anniversary of his arrival at Gethsemane Abbey. So I want to begin back at the beginning of his life and add a few notes here. As I said, he was born in France of New Zealand dad, American mom. Moved to the United States when he was less than 1 year old to live on Long Island. When he's 6 years old in 1921, his mother dies of breast cancer. Then his dad takes him to Bermuda, where he goes to paint, and then to France with his father in 1925, 3 years later. Goes to school there, then to England when he's all of 13, I guess that's right. And his father dies of a brain tumor himself, 1931. So Merton's only 16. So he loses both parents very early, both to cancer. One can imagine that he seemed to be someone very much in a hurry to live. Wrote his first novel at the age of 8. So he was a born writer, for one thing. Got a scholarship to Clare College, Cambridge, when he was only 17. Visited Italy to study modern languages, French and Italian. In 1933, a girl he was seeing in England became pregnant. And his guardian, he had a guardian by this time since his father had died. The guardian controlled funds, I guess, to support Merton. There must have been some family money. They weren't just, starving artists. The guardian had bailed him out of jail several times for drunkenness or one thing or another. And this girl became pregnant. And as far as we know, Merton never saw the child, never saw the woman later. I read somewhere of the possible death of the mother and child in the London Blitz during the war. I don't think that's verified. Anyway, it says a little bit about, how he was living. After that problem was settled with money from the guardian, Merton was summoned home by the guardian, that is, made to come back to the United States, at which point he entered Columbia University and found some stability there. Took a class in medieval philosophy, which really interested him in matters of faith and the Catholic Church. He just found himself attracted like a magnet to Catholic churches. At Columbia, he was very popular. He wrote a lot for the humor magazine they had there. Was someone who people were drawn to, like moth to a flame. Graduated and began working immediately on a master's degree in English, and was received into the Catholic Church in 1938. So he's 23 years old, and taught English at St. Bonaventure College, which is a Franciscan college. Was writing, had written a couple of novels which he had submitted, which were not accepted. They didn't seem to have any real direction, according to the editor, who would eventually be the one who would accept Seven Story Mountain. And he decided He didn't want to be a professor of English. He didn't even really want to be a novelist that badly. When asked, what he was busy with, he said, "I'm a Catholic," which is probably not a lot of money in that, but that's what he told people. That was his center. And so he applied to become a Franciscan monk, and was initially accepted until he became open about his past in England. And the Franciscans, probably to their everlasting sadness, rejected him. Um, he then went to Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky, a Trappist monastery, for a week of retreat some months later, and then entered Gethsemane for 27 years until his death in 1941. He said, "I felt my roaming had ended and that I had come home." He also believed he had said sort of a goodbye forever to the modern world, which he saw, coming apart at the seams because of the Second Great War in only a couple of decades. He also felt he was trying to leave behind his old self, his sarcasm, his harsh judgment of others. He was very proud. Um, he also, I think, was feeling that he was finally under house arrest at the monastery when it came to his impulsiveness, which was a basic part of his character. Um, Important to note here is that hundreds of young men entered monasteries all over the country after World War II. There was just an explosion of faith. Um, People turning from, what humans did in making war to wanting something else. I'm imagining there probably were millions of young men in foxholes, the bellies of airplanes, the bellies of ships all over the world, promising God that if they survived the war, they would, do some great thing for God. Um, but there were hundreds of young men who entered monasteries um, in the years after the war. One big reason, besides the war itself, um, was Merton's book, because pretty quickly 600,000 copies of Seven Story Mountain, his autobiography written after 7 years in the monastery, um, became, as I said, a bestseller, and a lot of those guys read that book. I remember talking to one who was at the Abbey here in Carlton, who said, "Yeah, that's all he needed was to read that book, and boom, he was there for life." Um, the monastery did a lot of work in his heart, but he did a lot to change the monastery as well. When he got there, uh, Jansenism was very strong. We talked about it last week, if you were here, in connection with Saint Therese. The idea that, the way out of purgatory is to endure as much hardship on earth as you can to pay for your sins. So, God's very wrathful according to this way of looking at things. And the Catholic Church was highly influenced by that thought that came about in the 19th century and was big in the Catholic Church until the early 60s and the movement called Vatican II. So he enters the monastery, and this is the happiest time of his life, but it's not an easy life. The monastery itself was freezing in the wintertime. There was no heat in the chapel, nor in the dorm where all these monks slept together in huge rooms. Um, and Merton, was reading everything he could get his hands on from the ample library they had. Among those were accounts of the Desert Fathers, the people we talked about in the beginning of this class, from the the third century, fourth and third century too, of uh, of the first millennia, right? Um, who lived in individual cells. And so Merton, prevailed upon the abbot uh, to take those monks out of a common room where they kept each other awake, snoring from 7 p.m. when they went to sleep to 2 a.m. in the morning. Uh, and they had ample room, so they made individual cells, and the monks were able to live a little bit more like the original desert fathers. This was a time when junior monks communicated with hand signals because they took a vow of silence along with other vows of stability and chastity and poverty. Um, One monk I saw on YouTube said that they had no sign for the word tractor, which was very important because they were an agricultural community. So they combined the sign for vegetable with the sign for machine. And that's the way they managed to communicate with each other. Um, at the end of his book, The Seven-Story Mountain, Merton said, "Here ends the book, but not the searching." Um, and with that, he became, quote, "the most famous monk in America," which Thomas Merton found abundantly hilarious, to be the most famous monk in America. It just wasn't anything he set out to do. His abbot told him, write the book, and he did it. In a few years, though, he came to regret the tone of pious scorn for the world that was in that book. He had regarded the monastery as a secluded haven, a place free from the selfishness of the world, and he just felt he just went overboard with that. He also hated that the book's popularity turned him into a plaster saint. He called himself a plaster saint to be worshipped by Catholic school children. Um, the Catholic Church, of course, was very happy about the popularity of the book. The Abbey at Gethsemani is still reaping lots and lots of money from the sale of all of his books. It was a very orthodox book, and so the Catholic Church had an interest in keeping Merton as that very young, very pious monk. But, there's no way to keep that man that way. It just wasn't going to be from the beginning who he was. And here is one way of tracing a change in him that I think is really important. In 1948, on an errand into Louisville for the monastery, uh, he said the city and its busyness bored him. He wrote this in his journal. He felt separate from it. He felt empathy for the people he saw in the streets, but he felt removed from them and a bit piteous. That's 1948. He'd been there 7 years. 10 years later, on another errand for the monastery into Louisville, he wrote this, which may be his most important, well, not most important, but his most famous word. It said, "In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut," which now has become Thomas Merton Plaza. There's a plaque there. "In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. The whole illusion of a separate holy existence is a dream. Not that I question the reality of my vocation or my monastic life, but the conception of separation from the world that we have in the monastery too easily presents itself as a complete illusion. The illusion that by making vows, we become a different species of being, pseudo-angels, spiritual men, men of interior life, what have you. This sense of liberation from an illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud," he writes. "I have the immense joy of being a man, a member of a race in which God himself, there we go, became incarnate, as if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me now that I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. There are no strangers. The gate of heaven is everywhere. So we began this study talking about mysticism as, an experience-based thing where people see beyond the pale. And Merton, like all the rest of the mystics, had his own epiphanies, and this is certainly the one that comes across as most significant to the world. He'd begun life in the monastery with the idea that holiness was about separateness and ascetical self-denial, and he threw all that away, as if he were awakening from the illusion of separateness. He said he was gradually giving up asceticism for humanism, and was criticized for this, for getting involved in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and most significantly, the anti-nuclear movement. Some among the Catholic Church criticized him for becoming too worldly. Others on the outside said, "Why are you hiding out in a monastery?" So he couldn't please anyone, it seemed. But he did this thing. He came to see that social action and contemplation went hand in hand, which is probably why Richard Rohr's organization in New Mexico is called the Center for Action and Contemplation. As he grew more interested in helping the world, there was a counter movement in his soul to want more and more isolation. He was writing more and more letters. A lot of the work the Catholic Church would not publish anymore on issues like the nuclear possibility of nuclear war, civil rights, the war in Vietnam. He wrote like crazy about these things. It was all circulated to like-minded people in the United States. At the same time, he was longing for more and more silence at the monastery. He also was trying he always had a plan to go somewhere else and do some other things. And every time his abbot would say no, which Merton actually welcomed in the end, knowing what we all talked about on our first time when we were talking about the desert community. And that is, whenever you want to get away from something, you can never do it, because you're going to take your character, your foibles, everything about you you're trying to get away from with you. And Merton knew this completely. And yet he had this incredible restless spirit and was always trying to go out to New Mexico, or had an idea to go to Nevada, or Old Mexico, or Alaska, or finally Northern California. We'll talk a little bit about that toward the end here. A more lenient abbot finally came along in the mid-60s and allowed Merton to live in a hermitage by himself on the property there at Gethsemane. There have always been hermit abbots, or excuse me, hermit monks, comes from the word hermit anyway. Let him live at a distance. And at first, all he had to do was come in weekly for Sunday Mass and dinner. But he lost a lot of weight, hating to cook. So the abbot ordered him to come in every day for dinner, which actually worked out pretty well. Now, I want to mention a friend of mine who comes into the story here about this time, actually just before Merton was in the monastery, in the hermitage. And this friend is John Heidbrink, who is pastor of Mill City Presbyterian Church. here in Oregon from the 80s into the 90s. Say a word about John, but here's John. This is Merton, of course. And do you know who this is?
That
The gentleman, the Asian gentleman there, Vietnamese gentleman, is Thich Nhat Hanh. John introduced Merton and Thich Nhat Hanh to one another. Let me explain how. A minister who ends up in a tiny mill town in Oregon gets to that place. John had been born in Oklahoma City in about 1930, was campus pastor at the University of New Mexico, a Presbyterian minister, and then University of Oklahoma, where he met Martin Luther King Jr., who came to Oklahoma City to meet John and others who were working to integrate the city of Oklahoma peacefully, which they had accomplished. John told Martin that he wanted to work more in the civil rights efforts. And Martin Luther King Jr. told him, well, then, as a white man, you should join the Fellowship of Reconciliation. They're doing really good work. FOR is what it's called, too, and it's still going. It's based in New York City. And in New York City, in their office, they had a secretary whose name was Dorothy Day, who's on her way to becoming a Catholic saint herself. She'd been a playwright, a memoirist. Anyway, she and John got along well. They met every day. And she told John that Thomas Merton, author of Seven Story Mountain and other things, was longing for ecumenical contacts. So John was the best letter writer I've ever known, just a remarkable man. He'd had a correspondence in high school with Betty Davis because they both liked the author Marcel Proust. John's life is full of things like that. Anyway, so he reached out to Merton. Merton was anxious to reach back to him. And then John went to Gethsemane in the very early 60s, pre-Hermitage, to visit Merton. And Merton instructed him, we'll have our visit. After that, you get in your car and you drive around the circle by the gatehouse, and I'll hide behind a bush. And when you come by, I'll get in the back seat and get down real low. And you drive out and we'll go. I know where there's a great lake and a little store. So that's just what they did repeatedly. John would visit Merton whenever he could. When he was in Kentucky, John traveled the country constantly for the FOR. And they would always go to the same little lake and skinny dip. But first they'd get a 6-pack of beer, which was Thomas Merton's favorite thing. He said at one point, I drink beer anytime I can get it. I love beer like I love the whole world. I think that sounds very much like the man. John helped him circulate a number of things that he wrote. I want to go back to something we looked at again on that first Sunday night 6 weeks ago about the desert community, the desert mothers and fathers. You might remember that Merton had written one of the first introductions to one of the early collections about those monks. Here's what he said. The simple men who lived their lives out to good old age among the rocks and sands of Egypt only did so because they had come into the desert to be themselves, their ordinary selves, and to forget a world that divided them from themselves. There can be no other valid reason for seeking solitude or for leaving the world, and thus to leave the world is, in fact, to help save it in saving oneself. This is the final point, and it's an important one. The Egyptian hermits who left the world as though escaping from a wreck did not merely intend to save themselves. They knew that they were helpless to do any good for others as long as they floundered about in the wreckage. But once they got a foothold on solid ground, things were different. Then they had not only the power, but even the obligation to pull the whole world to safety after them. So that's a real important statement about what Merton felt he was about. By going into the monastery, he originally was thinking that he was escaping the world, but there he felt that he gained a certain amount of mental peace that he'd never had before that. And only from the foundation of having that kind of mental peace, I'm using a word that the Dalai Lama used when he talked about his relationship with Merton as they met in Merton's last summer of life, that they were doing similar work for mental peace on earth. So you do what you can to save yourself, and then once you've felt you're living with a certain kind of mental and spiritual equanimity, then you do your darndest to drag the world to safety yourself. And that's what Merton was always about with his writing. He always had this love-hate relationship with monastic life. Um, Here's a late journal entry I find really interesting. He says, I think the monastic life as we live it here warps people, kills their spirit, reduces them to something less than human. He found it intolerable and degrading, quote, to have to spend my life contributing to the maintenance of this illusion, the illusion of the great, gay, joyous, peppy, optimistic, Jesus-loving, 100% American Trappist monastery. Fantastic writer, and you know, funny as heck, and wringing his hands at what was going on in the monastery, the lousy theology he said he found everywhere. He was not a really popular man in his monastery. There were a few who actually, pretty much worshipped him, but a lot of them said that they didn't like the fact that he was kind of judgmental of them, not being more like he was. Okay. Also, you may have heard that he had an affair in 1965 with a nurse. He'd had some back surgery in Louisville, and while he was there, fell in love with a nurse whose name we know as Margie Smith. He refers to her in his journals he left behind at his death, as M. He was 51, she was 25 years old, and engaged to somebody else. The relationship went on until he used a phone at the gate of the monastery and was overheard by other monks talking to this woman, one of whom turned him in to the abbot, who insisted that he give up the relationship, which he did. However, he still talked to the young woman as often as he could, and they made their peace with each other. The remarkable thing about this woman is that she never wrote a book about this. She did speak to a journalist in one case who called her, but seemed to be someone who had such love and respect for this man even after he died, that she never sought to have any money come out of it, though she could easily have done that. Any questions at this point before we get to the end of his life and a few things? Let me share from a book that Eileen gave me for my birthday called Thomas Merton in California. At the end of his life, not meaning this to be the end of his life, he accepted an invitation to go to Bangkok and meet with monks of all stripes, and discuss monkhood and issues of the day. On the way, he went to Christ in the Desert Monastery across the way from Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. He also went to San Francisco, visiting Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who published books of poetry by Merton. Ferlinghetti was the owner of City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, as you may know. And when interviewed afterward about Merton's visit to him, he said he noticed that Merton paid a lot of attention to young women who walked up and down the streets of San Francisco, as any monk would, who's stuck behind a wall and happens to be heterosexual, I guess. So I want to read a little bit from this. He went to a wonderful convent, I think it was, in Northern California among the redwoods, which he just found stunning and decided he wanted to go live at if possible. But he was always attracted to everything. Here's something he wrote here that I love this because it's unfiltered, totally off the record. It's just, I guess, a record, probably from a tape recording that somebody wrote the transcript up afterward. He says, let's face it. Let's face the fact that the Catholic contemplative life is at the moment under a strong attack from progressive Catholics. Okay, now we think today, Richard Rohr, contemplative Catholic, progressive Catholics love that. Not in 1968, apparently. He writes, you will find people regularly appearing in the pages of the National Catholic Reporter asking, quote, can a cloistered life be Christian? And these are progressives who are all about social action, right? About ending the war in Vietnam, and all kinds of things. Merton continues, I mean, can cloistered nuns be saved, they ask, without leaving the convent? This is one of the great current questions in the National Catholic Reporter. Is a cloistered nun a Christian at all? And then there are all sorts of arguments about how they can't really be Christians. They're poor, deluded people, and so forth. We were replying rather weakly, meaning we among the monastics were replying rather weakly and ambiguously. We were coming back with the same old thing again and again. Well, we're praying for the world, we say. Well, that just doesn't cut any ice anymore. Of course, we do not really have to justify ourselves in their eyes. That's not necessarily our job. But we do have to face the fact that it does raise doubts in our own hearts. And it's good for us to doubt. We should doubt, and we should question our vocation. St. Bernard questioned his vocation. He said, what are you here for? He questioned our vocation. So you develop in life as to frequently question your vocation seriously. And it has to be questioned. It has to be, because otherwise it doesn't grow. And I could go on record here as being one of the group that can say that the people who think that you should be constantly going back to your novitiate all through your religious life, that's very nice for a certain point of view, but it cannot possibly mean that you just constantly go back to the person you were then. You may go back to the same kind of enthusiasm of a different situation, but you cannot once again become that person. I would not, under any circumstances, want to be the person that I was in Gethsemane Abbey in 1942. If I were, I'd probably need a straitjacket. You do develop and things change, he said. And then he gets kind of theological. But we do have to take stock of our lives. We have to take stock of this whole question of the contemplative life. The word contemplative itself is a very difficult concept to deal with anymore as a result, as a real description of our life. Why? Because it has a bad heritage. Contemplative is a Platonic word, and the thing that's really about it is not that, quote, contemplative equals solitude, or contemplative equals silence, but that contemplative suggests something that is very misleading in all descriptions of our kind of life. It suggests a subject-object division. A contemplative is a subject contemplating an object. Now, you find right away that one of the basic things that we have to discover in our life is that God is not an object. God is a subject. If you contemplate God as an object in our life, this may be very interesting and profitable, but it is not really what we are called to do, because we are called not just to look at God, but to live in God, and God in us, and we in God, in such a way that God is the subject of our subject. God is the isness of our is, the isness of our existence, or however you want to put it. Now, I read that whole thing because that's very Merton-like. He's basically talking against dualism, about the idea that, you contemplate God, God is up there somewhere else. Richard Rohr went out to Gethsemane and was invited to stay at Merton's hermitage for a month. And one day he was walking and he saw an old uh, person who'd formerly been an abbot there, but who was now a hermit living in his own hermitage, found him on the path. And that hermit recognized Rohr by Rohr's being pretty well known. And the former abbot and hermit said, "Please tell the world one thing for me." He said, "God is not up there." That was all. He said, then he went walking along. It was the same message that if God is anywhere, God is within us, and we can be, God is us. Somehow we're all of the same stuff. We just don't know that. So Merton was onto that before a lot of people, I think. So let me close with a little bit here about when he went to Asia. By the time he went to Asia, this is 1968, he's 53 years old, I guess, um, going to meet with monks of all stripes. His friend, Bob Lax, who had been a student at Columbia at the same time as Merton, um, said that Merton at this point was more tied to being a monk than he was to being a Catholic or even a Christian. That is that he'd gone to a place where when he met with monks, they had more in common, even if they were from, Sufis or Buddhists, they had more in common than he had with people worshiping a Christian God. They had a bond that transcended their religious tradition. And somebody pointed out that the word of the day at the time from Teilhard de Chardin was this line that you probably have heard, that everything that rises must converge. And that is something that Merton believed with all his heart, that that as monks opened their hearts to whatever it is they understood as God, they found a ground of being together. It just is an inevitability of that search, according to Merton. So anyway, here's a little bit more on that. Before he embarked for Asia, he said, "May I not come back without having settled the great affair and found also the great compassion. I am going home, to the home where I have never been in this body." Someone wrote, there are hints of how he might have settled this great affair. For instance, that the great affair had to do with what I was just speaking about, the fact that there are things that transcend religion. And there are, that we are not separated from one another, even by things that we hold the dearest. For instance, he wrote of meeting an Indian hermit called Chatral Rinpoche. Quote, "The unspoken or half unspoken the unspoken or half-spoken message of our talk was our complete understanding of each other as people who were on the edge of a great realization and knew it, and were trying somehow or other to go out and get lost in it. So there again is the idea that there's monks who recognize each other on sight, uh, and whose hearts are bent the very same way. And again, no creed or list of beliefs can get in the way of that or transcend that. He also had a dream early on the trip. He said, last night, he wrote this in his journal, last night I dreamed I was temporarily back at the Abbey at Gethsemane, and I was dressed in Buddhist monk's habit. There it is. That's a wonderful picture of what we're talking about. All right. I think that's where this whole business of mysticism takes you eventually, I think, inevitably. Questions, comments? Some of you read more of this than I have, I bet.
I was wondering, did he contemplate Buddhism,
Oh, yeah.
being a Buddhist? Is that
Oh,
why he went back?
well, he read a lot of Buddhism and he taught. I didn't say this, that he was a novice master at the monastery in Kentucky before he became a hermit. Um, but he taught, he had latitude to teach anything he wanted, and he taught Buddhist spirituality there, along with everything else under the sun. Yeah.
So he had teachers that were Buddhist of
He
nature.
just read voraciously, and then he wrote letters voraciously to anybody who was interested in getting to know him, and he them.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking a lot of that sounds almost like Pema Chodron, a little bit of
Yes.
the spirituality of Buddhism, I can never say the word, equanimity of
Equanimity.
all. Yeah.
Well
It
said.
sounded like that. Plus, the reason I like hearing about him is because I was in Northern California and Central California, and when I was raised in the church in late 60s, they were changing from Vatican to Vatican II. I'm sure a lot of us were in that position. There were a lot of changes going on in the church, and I heard about Thomas Merton for sure.
Yeah.
But
that's right.
That was kind of intro part of the nuns were starting to change. We could change, we didn't have to wear hats in church. Things were really starting to look like, why are we doing what we're doing? The real ritualistic Latin and that kind of thing. Yeah, because I was raised Catholic, so that's what we were doing.
That all happened about 1962 and later. Anything else from y'all? Yes.
I came to this a little late, and I've only been able to enjoy one other lecture. But if we could step back, and if you could help me understand what is the concept of mysticism. I don't know that I can. I don't know. What is that?
Somebody else want to jump in there? I mean, we can give an academic kind of answer. I threw one out in the first class, but anybody else want to say a word about it?
Well, it's the idea that we can experience God without mediation. So you could be anywhere and be united with God. God united with you, minus the screens and hang-ups and whatnot that we
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That We don't need filters. Our relationship. Go ahead, Kathy. Oops, can't hear you.
I was just going to say that we have all of the classes in the series available as recordings too. So you could go back and listen like to the first one, and that might give you a refreshed overview of that if you've now discovered that this is something that you're interested in.
Mhm.
They're available on YouTube on the Southminster Presbyterian Church channel, which
Right.
is pretty easy to find with Google.
Just Google Southminster Presbyterian Beaverton, you'll find it on YouTube. Yeah.
I would add that there's, Christian mysticism as a separate sort of arm of Christianity happened after the corporate takeover of the Roman Empire back in the 300s, and
Right.
there are those who would say that the experience of Christianity for the first 300 years of the faith had a very mystical kind of living in communion with the Holy Spirit of Jesus, who is a great wisdom teacher kind of aspect to it. And that when emperors got involved, they kind of made it a lot more formal and doctrinal, and really kind of changed Christianity. And so mysticism carried on as a kind of a wisdom branch of Christianity that kind of eschewed the authority of empire and affirmed the ability of individual people to commune with God, as Larry mentioned, and kind of in the same way that the Sufi tradition is in Islam and the Kabbalah tradition is in Judaism. It's kind of the wisdom and personal spirituality aspect of the faith that might get totally lost if you rely on, the authority structure of the faith to be everything.
Well said.
Need a lot more of that wisdom.
Yeah.
There you go. It's not going away.
I have another question,
Sure.
maybe taking us away, but I'm just curious because our previous minister was very, very interested in Merton, and he talked about him a lot, and he felt really strongly that he was murdered by the CIA. Can you tell us any thoughts you have on that? And I mean, I know a lot of people here went to lectures that he did that talked about that, and it was interesting. And I know he was doing political work and different things, but I just had to ask it because that was something that we talked about quite a bit.
Yeah. So we should go through the circumstances of his death. He had given a talk just an hour before his death at this conference. There was some tension there among Buddhists and Christians about a number of issues that I'm really not up on. Merton was looking forward to the evening panel, which he would be part of, and finished his talk by saying, now I will disappear and we'll all go and have a Coke. That is an exact quote. And he went away. It was the only talk of his life that was ever videotaped. So you can go on YouTube and go to Merton in Bangkok and you'll find that. He went back to his room and at some point had a shower. And it was it's believed by most, that he came out of the shower. It was a tile floor, slipped and grabbed the one thing that was standing there that might steady him, which was a large electric fan. And it wasn't grounded. And he was electrocuted. And when the first people came into the room, when he didn't show up for whatever it was supposed to show up for in the afternoon, they found him with the fan actually on his body and still pulsing with electricity, which is very unfortunate. Yeah, I've heard, along with everyone else, that there's a possibility that he was murdered. I hadn't heard by the CIA. I heard by the Catholic Church. They didn't like him being so involved in these things. It sounds a little preposterous, frankly. But it's out there, it will always be there, and no one will ever be able to say categorically yes or no to it because he died alone. Vince? Was anybody? Oh, I wondered if somebody was saying anything.
Can't hear you, Vince.
So I'm not sure he wanted to say anything. He was just scratching his head, maybe.
All right.
Okay. Let me share something. Do you all know what a found poem is? There are poems you write yourself, and then there are ones where you're looking at a newspaper and there's something there, and you look at it and you go, oh my gosh, that's a poem all by itself. I'm going to just write that down and call it a poem, see what other people think. Well, I was once reading in one of Merton's journals, and I found this extract that by itself sounded to me like a poem. So I wrote it all out and I sent it to a journal called the Merton Seasonal, which, is an academic journal about Thomas Merton that's published 4 times a year. And they ran this in their journal. They don't usually publish poems, but this one was right for Merton, so they thought this would work. And it comes from his experience in the monastery in 1949. And he put this extract in his journal about the infirmary where monks at the abbey would go to die. So I titled this myself from the extract. It's called Urge to Travel, which is kind of interesting for people who are secluded too. Urge to Travel. And then my epigraph is from an entry for March 15th, 1949 in a journal of Thomas Merton. And here it goes. Father George came bursting in, made signs of thank you 3 or 4 times. Remember, they're using hand gestures instead of words. So I'll start again. Father George came in, bursting in, making signs of thank you 3 or 4 times and departed. Last night he came down and wandered around the monastery. Reverend Father, who used to be the infirmarian, says that sometimes when they are near death, they get the urge to travel. There was a brother Mary up there who used to be gatekeeper. He was dying. He had a wooden leg and cane. He used to take his cane and go clumping around instead of staying in bed. They hid his wooden leg. He found it behind the door, put it on, and got going. They hid it again in a closet where he couldn't find it. He lay in bed, waving his hands and making signs. The cane, the cane. There was another brother who was dying. It was summer and very hot. He was in bed with very few clothes on. They found him walking out the infirmary with nothing on but his shirt. Where are you going? They asked him. Nebraska, he said. That's the end. Okay. Well, this has been a fun ride. We're at 8 o'clock, and I want to thank y'all for joining in. You might want to read some Merton. There's at least 60 books out there of his. I generally recommend The 7-Story Mountain just because it's so readable. Merton would not say it's his best writing, but because again, it is kind of old school Catholic, and he changed quite a bit since then, but it's still wonderful storytelling. So I always recommend that. There's also this book, an old book called The Merton Reader. And it's pretty well chosen material from many of his works. Since this book came out, though, there are a lot of Merton's individual journals that have been published. And they really give you an idea of the real human being behind all of the more edited writings. How's that? Okay, blessings on all. Hope something rises from the midst of all of these times together that takes you on a journey that's spiritual and may be just what you need right now. Okay. Happy Holy Week. See you around.
Sure. So you can stop the recording now, Scott.
Oh,
Okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Scott.
You betcha, buddy. Thank you
And
very
it's
much.
great.
So much.
Very-
Lovely.
Very
Okay.
good.